Hi, I'm Dan Murphy. I'd like to take this video to spend a little time explaining setting up the Blue Feather torch. I've spent literally days on my flow bench trying to come up with a simple number for everybody to use, and I can't do that. There's so many different variables that affect it. We're going to go through the mechanics of what makes the flame work the way you want it to work. We're going to talk about diameter hose, we're going to talk about length of hose and how they affect our numbers. If you're using our number 6 tip, which needs 4 pounds of pressure at the torch valve body, using 1/8 inch diameter hoses, you're going to want to have someplace around 10-11 pounds on your gauges. If you use 3/16 diameter hose, which is about 2 1/4 times larger area than 1/8 inch hose, you're going to end up with about 7 pounds on your gauges. If you want to go one step farther and get 1/4 inch hose, your gauge readings are going to be closer yet to the 4 pounds required at the valve body to run our number 6 tip. As your tip sizes decrease in size, your line losses will be less and less and less. One example would be with our number 3 tip, 3/16 hose. Now you're down to about 4.5–5 pounds on your gauges. Pretty much what you do is to let the torch tell you what it needs and adjust your gauges appropriately. During the last 10–11 years that I've had my torch, I've always had small hoses on it, and I've never had the larger hoses. Generally what I'm using this torch for mostly are smaller projects, so you want the flexibility of your small hoses. If you need to run one of the bigger tips, you might want to consider some bigger hoses so you don't have to run your pressures quite as high. Or in my case, I've always just grabbed my other torch if I needed something bigger. Next, I'm going to demonstrate Blue Feather torch with our number 6 tip. First, we'll turn on the tanks. Open your valve slowly. Then we'll start dialing. I'm just going to put 4 or 5 pounds on them and get the torch lit. What we're demonstrating now is adjustment of the flame by using the regulators with the valves wide open on the torch. You're going to see how flame is nice and bushy, and we're going to start bringing in this inner feather a little bit until it matches, which that gives you a neutral flame at that point. And it also, what it does is it helps equalize the pressures. Having a balanced pressure helps reduce the chance of getting backflow in your hoses. Next, I'm going to demonstrate our small tip, which is 11.8 thousandths of an inch in diameter, and try and demonstrate the controllability of the valves on this torch. The regulators are still set at our 11 pounds that we used on that monster tip. And you can see how much control I have over the flame. You can see how far the valves are open. And this is with 11 pounds behind them. Okay, to try and answer the question on where you set your regulators, I hope I've explained a little bit of why it's difficult to give a number like that. Hose lengths, internal diameters on hoses have a huge effect on everything. But through the demonstration, you could also see that we used pretty good sized tip all the way down to a little micro tip on the same torch with lightweight hoses on it. Makes the torch very versatile from big projects down to small projects. This is something I did with the micro tip. You can see I soldered this together where I didn't do hardly any damage at all to the insulation on the wires. So we've talked about some of the mechanics of setting your pressures on the Blue Feather torch. About all I can say is your number 6 tip requires about 4 pounds of pressure at the valve body. Our number 6.5 tip actually requires about 5 pounds at the valve body. Then you go all the way down to the bottom end, our -2. You're down to about 1.5 pounds, 2 pounds. As high as 2.5 is about as far as you can push it. And it's just a matter of delivering the pressure and flow to the torch to satisfy its needs. Watch the flame. What's the flame need? That'll answer your question on what you do with pressures. If you increase the pressures on your gauges, you have to make adjustments at your valve body to affect the final fire that you're looking for. Changing these pressures up here, you compensate with here, so there's not a change here. You're probably going to see a lot of confusion thinking that your torch becomes more economical to run if you use lower pressures on your gauges. Well, look at your valve body as another form of a pressure regulator controlled by the operator. So basically all you have is another pressure regulator. And by watching the flame, you adjust your pressures required to satisfy your flame with your valves. Changing your pressures upstream has no effect on your final product as long as there's enough pressure to get the required flame that you're looking for. Is there a definite answer, this much pressure with this tip? No. It all depends on variables which we've discussed. We're going to talk about your regulators. I just recently bought these regulators, and the gauge that come with the regulator goes from 0 to 200. The peg where it starts to read is about 5 pounds. That's right where we want to be reading. So I went back to my welding supplier and I ordered another gauge. This gauge goes up to 60 pounds. With the pressures that you're trying to work with on this torch, it's an advantage to having a gauge with finer resolution for measuring your pressures. Next thing we're going to talk about are flash arresters and check valves. My check valves and flashback arresters are installed on the gauges. When you buy them, you can get them for mounting on your torch or mounting on your gauges. After playing games on my flow bench and seeing some of the things that can happen, it made a believer out of me, and I went down and bought my flashback arresters. I hope you found this video to be informative, answer some of your questions on setting pressures on an oxygen acetylene torch. The use of an oxygen acetylene torch can be very rewarding, and it's just a lot of fun. I prefer oxygen acetylene welding over all different forms of welding. I encourage you to seek professional instruction in the use of oxygen acetylene torches. Be careful on where you get your information from as you increase your knowledge. When you run across people that say, I've done it for 30 years and I've never had a problem, all that means is they haven't had the right set of circumstances and it hasn't happened yet. There's people that are out there that have wrote rules, procedures for using oxygen acetylene. You need to follow those rules and procedures. And through the use of proper use, it can be very safe and very rewarding.